Picture scrolling through an old phone, the kind of slow, half-distracted scrolling you do on a Sunday night when you're supposed to be doing something else. Photos blur past, vacations, ordinary Tuesdays, faces you barely remember tagging. And then your thumb stops. One photo. You almost swipe past it 100 times. You almost delete it more than once. Your finger actually hovering over the button before something stops you every single time. Most people who heard about a photo like that would assume it was an ex. The last picture with someone she used to love, kept out of longing or nostalgia or some unfinished romantic thread she couldn't quite cut. That wasn't it. The person in that photo was never anyone's boyfriend, and the reason she couldn't delete it had nothing to do with romance at all. I'll tell you who was actually in the photo, but first you should know what that day was like. Before either of them understood it was the last one, I'm Clara, and this is a closure session. Let's begin. The photo was ordinary, almost aggressively so. Two women sitting on a curb outside a coffee shop, both laughing at something the camera hadn't caught, iced coffee sweating in the afternoon heat, one of them wearing sunglasses pushed up into her hair instead of over her eyes. Nothing about the composition suggested significance. It was the kind of photo you take 100 of and forget about within a week. Her name was Priya. They'd met in their first year of university, assigned to the same dorm floor by an algorithm neither of them ever thanked properly, and had become the kind of close that happens fast when you're 18 and far from home for the first time, inseparable within a month, the kind of friendship that felt less like something built and more like something discovered. Already complete, just waiting to be noticed, she remembered specific, small details from those early years with a clarity that surprised her later. The terrible instant noodles they'd survived on during exam weeks, the running joke about a professor's tie collection that somehow stayed funny for 4 straight years, the way Priya always knew without being told exactly when she needed someone to just sit with her rather than offer advice. Those weren't dramatic memories. They were just the accumulated texture of 9 years spent genuinely knowing another person, the specific kind of knowing that only builds through thousands of ordinary, unremarkable moments. For almost a decade after that, Priya had been the fixed point in her life that everything else got measured against. Boyfriends came and went, and Priya was still there. Jobs changed, cities shifted, and Priya was still the first call after anything important happened, good or bad. They had a rhythm to their friendship that felt permanent in the specific, unexamined way you only really notice permanence once it stops. The photo was from a Saturday in early autumn, 4 years ago now, a spontaneous afternoon that had started with a text, coffee, and turned into 6 unplanned hours of wandering the city together. The kind of day with no real agenda that ends up mattering more than the trips you actually plan for. They talked about everything and nothing. A messy breakup Priya was recovering from, a job offer she was deciding whether to take. The specific meandering conversation that happens between two people who've run out of things they need to say and have moved fully into the things they simply want to say. Neither of them had any reason to think it was significant. It was just a good day, one of hundreds of good days they'd had together over 9 years of friendship. The falling out, when it came, arrived less than a month later, and it wasn't dramatic in the way falling outs are supposed to be dramatic. There was a disagreement about a mutual friend's wedding seating arrangements, of all things, a small logistical conflict that somehow uncovered a much older, unaddressed resentment between them. Priya had said something sharp about feeling like she always came second to whichever relationship she was in at the time. She'd said something equally sharp back about feeling like Priya expected more availability than any friendship reasonably required. Neither comment was entirely fair. Both contained enough truth to actually land. That's often how the worst arguments work, not built on lies, but on a small, sharpened piece of something real, aimed with enough precision to actually wound. In the moment, neither of them had the presence of mind to soften what they were saying, both too surprised by the sudden intensity of a conversation that had started over something as small as table assignments. They didn't speak again after that conversation, not out of any dramatic decision to cut each other off, more a mutual, unspoken standoff, both of them waiting for the other to reach out first, both too proud or too hurt anyone who did. Weeks turned into months. The wedding happened, and they sat at separate tables without acknowledging each other beyond a stiff, polite nod. A year passed, then two. The friendship that had once felt like the most permanent fixture in her life simply stopped, without ceremony, without a real ending, just a slow fade into silence neither of them ever formally closed. She noticed the absence in strange, specific ways during those years, reaching for her phone to share something funny, before remembering there was no longer anyone on the other end who'd immediately understand why it was funny. Seeing a movie she knew Priya would have loved, and feeling an odd, hollow pang at not being able to text about it afterward. Small things mostly, but they accumulated into a persistent background awareness of a person-shaped absence in her daily life that never fully faded, even as the specific anger from the argument itself gradually did. She thought about reaching out more times than she could count. Started texts she never sent, rehearsed apologies she never delivered, unsure even years later exactly what she'd be apologizing for. Since the original disagreement had faded into something almost unrecognizable compared to the actual damage, 9 years of closeness, gone over a seating chart that neither of them probably even remembered the specifics of anymore. But the moment I mentioned at the beginning, the real reason the photo mattered so much, hadn't fully landed yet. That came almost 2 years after the falling out, through a mutual friend's offhand comment during an unrelated conversation. The friend mentioned casually that Priya had moved out of the country entirely, a job opportunity in another part of the world, a decision made relatively quickly, already in motion by the time the friend happened to mention it. She sat with that information for a long time after the conversation ended, not because the move itself was shocking. Priya had always talked about wanting to live abroad eventually. What hit her was smaller and more specific. The realization that an entire chapter of Priya's life had happened without her, a decision that big, that significant, and she'd learned about it secondhand, weeks after the fact, from someone who wasn't even particularly close to either of them. That was when she went looking for the photo, not consciously deciding to grieve something, just an impulse, scrolling back through old albums, looking for evidence of a friendship that had once felt so solid it hadn't occurred to her it needed protecting. She found dozens of photos of the two of them, most she could smile at distantly, the way you look at old yearbook pictures. But that one photo, the curb, the iced coffees, the unremarkable Saturday, stopped her completely, because she realized sitting there that this was almost certainly the last photo of them together, the last good day. Before the seating chart conversation, before the silence, before Priya built an entire new life on a different continent that she now knew almost nothing about, she hadn't known on that ordinary Saturday that it was the last one. That's the part that undid her more than anything else. If she'd known, if either of them had known, maybe the day would have felt different. Maybe she would have paid closer attention, said something more meaningful, held on to the moment more deliberately instead of letting it pass as just another unremarkable afternoon among hundreds of others. This was the actual moment, not the falling out, not even the news of the move. This, sitting alone with her phone, staring at a photo of an ordinary day that had turned out, without either of them knowing it at the time, to be the final entry in 9 years of friendship. There's a particular grief specific to an unmarked last time. Breakups usually come with some warning, some final conversation, some acknowledgement in the moment that an ending is happening. Friendships that fade rarely offer that same courtesy. There's no final scene, no last dance. No clear moment either person can point back to and say, that was it, that was the end. Just an ordinary day that turns out only in hindsight to have been the last one. She thought about how much of grief is really about that specific unfairness, not just losing someone, but losing the chance to have known in the moment that you should have paid closer attention. If she'd known that Saturday was the last good day, she might have said something different at the end of it, might have hugged Priya a little longer, might have taken a better photo. One that actually captured something true about 9 years of friendship instead of just an ordinary afternoon that happened to have a camera pointed at it. But that's not usually how endings work, not the quiet kind. Most of the time, you don't get to know, you just live an ordinary day, and it turns turns out later to have been extraordinary only in retrospect, only because of what came after. Maybe you have your own version of that photo. Not necessarily a picture, maybe it's a text thread that went quiet without either of you deciding it should. A phone call you didn't know would be the last one. A goodbye that felt completely ordinary in the moment and only became significant once you understood much later that there wasn't going to be another one. Friendship grief carries a particularly rare kind of loneliness that romantic grief doesn't always carry the same way. There's no cultural script for it. No one sends flowers when a friendship ends. No one asks how you're holding up the way they would after a breakup. You're mostly expected to carry it quietly, without much acknowledgement that it's a real loss at all, even when it's shaped 9 years of who you became. Maybe you've also noticed the strange guilt that comes with grieving a friendship publicly, a worry that people will think it's disproportionate to be this affected by a friend, not a partner. That worry is worth setting down. The length and depth of a relationship was never determined by whether it was romantic. 9 years of genuine closeness leaves a real absence when it ends, regardless of what category the relationship technically fell into. I want you to hear something, and I want you to actually let it land, not just pass over you. You didn't fail to notice the last good day because you weren't paying attention. Most last days don't announce themselves. That's simply how endings work when nobody involved intends for them to be endings at all, quietly disguised as an ordinary Tuesday or an unremarkable Saturday. Indistinguishable from every other day until enough time has passed to reveal what it actually was. You're allowed to grieve a friendship with the same seriousness you'd grieve any other loss. It doesn't need a title, a ceremony, or anyone else's permission to count as real. 9 years or 5 or however many you had doesn't become smaller just because the ending arrived quietly instead of dramatically. You don't need to know retroactively exactly what went wrong to be allowed to heal from it. Sometimes a friendship simply ends over something small that uncovered something larger, and neither person is entirely at fault. And neither version of the story is complete enough to fully explain what happened. So here's what I'll leave you with tonight. If there's a photo, a memory, an unmarked last day you're still carrying, you're allowed to hold on to it. Not as a wound, but as proof that something real happened once between two people who mattered to each other for a long time. The friendship doesn't have to have ended perfectly for it to have been true while it lasted. Let it be quiet now. Let it be finished. Good night. I'm glad you were here tonight.